So I wanted to talk a little bit about habits and phobias and how we get them. So habits and phobias are based on patterns, and there's three different kinds of patterns that we have within us. So the first ones are natural patterns. So these are patterns that are just part of our operating system, and we're unable to change them, and we wouldn't want to change them. So natural patterns are things like breathing, heart beating, all of those kind of things. So if you like, as I say, part of the operating system, and we don't have the admin rights to access them. The second one is based on trauma. So, for example, we might have, in the example of someone who has a phobia of heights, we might have been on a bridge when we were young or in our childhood, and it might have been a flimsy bridge during high winds, and we were getting thrown around a bit, and we were already stressed from something else that happened during the day, and that stored that traumatic memory and created a phobia. The third one is learned. So, for example, one of our parents, again using heights as an example, might have had a fear of heights. Perhaps our father had a fear of heights, and he was forced to go up a ladder to address something urgent on the roof. And he was really making a big fuss about it, and he was, kind of getting really stressed and visibly shaking, and maybe he kind of slipped a little bit as he got on the first rung of the ladder and screamed out loudly. And we'd have viewed that as a child, and we'd have learned that habit of behavior, and that would have been stored within us. So what's the neuroscience behind phobias and habits then? So if you watch any of my earlier videos, you might be aware that I simplify the brain as being split into two different areas. So we've got the intellectual part of the brain and the primitive part of the brain. And I loosely simplified the primitive part of the brain into three different components. There was the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. And we'll start by talking about the amygdala because that has a big part to play in phobias. So we can maybe symbolize the amygdala as a person looking petrified, with a hair on end. And that kind of characterizes the amygdala to some degree because the amygdala is always on the lookout for danger. It's constantly vigilant, it's constantly on guard, and it's just trying to assess whether there's danger in any given moment. Now, everything comes through our senses, through hearing, sight, smell, touch, and it's all filtered at some point through the amygdala before it's processed by the brain. And as I say, the first thing that the amygdala will be looking out for is whether something's dangerous. And what it'll do is it'll ask the hippocampus. So you might remember the hippocampus, we can think of it as like the filing cabinet in our brain, or if we were to use a more modern terminology, you could think of it as like a computer database or kind of cloud storage, something along those lines. And it stores all of our learned habits and behaviors, and it also stores all of these patterns in there. So the amygdala will go to the hippocampus and say, this specific thing, is it dangerous? Use an example, silly example again. You walk into a new room, maybe you're attending a meeting or a party or a conference, and the first thing that you notice that's unusual about the room is that there's a brown carpet on the floor. You don't really see them these days. I mean, you do in our house at the moment because we're renovating a house that was decorated in the 70s, but they're perhaps not so common. So you walk into the room, the amygdala spots a brown carpet, and it's first thing it says, oh my God, brown carpet. So it says to the hippocampus, brown carpet, what's going on with this? And the hippocampus will quickly do a search, or it'll go through the filing cabinet, and it'll look for all of those things marked with brown carpet, all of those events in your life. Now, continuing with that example, imagine if you were a little baby and your parents put you down on the floor for the first time. And the first time you got put on the floor, there's a nice, soft, high pile brown carpet. And you went down and you felt this luxurious carpet, and it felt nice and comfortable and warm. And your parents were cooing over you, and you felt safe and secure. And they were laughing and giggling at your kind of silly little cute escapades. In that case, you might have stored the memory and the pattern that brown carpets equal nice, safety, nice, pleasant experience. On the flip side, your parents might have put you down on the brown carpet and you shot off on your hands and knees straight towards an open fire, and they panicked, screaming, grabbed you, and then they started arguing with each other as to whose fault that was. And then you might have stored that memory in your mind as being a traumatic or a negative memory associated with brown carpets. So depending on the pattern and the memory that you stored, you'd get a different response back from the hippocampus, or you may well get a different response back. So, depending on the case, the hippocampus might go back and say, "Brown carpets, be aware, send the alarm off because there's a potential danger there." And if that was the case, then the amygdala would flag that to the hippocampus. And you might remember the hippocampus is the chemist of the brain. I can't actually think how to symbolize that in this case, but just go with me. It's the chemist of the brain. So that will produce a chemical response in your mind and your body, which will get you to react in a panicked way. So might release adrenaline or cortisol. On the flip side, again, if the hippocampus came back with a positive, then the amygdala would just stand down and let that one pass. So when we've got a phobia or a unhelpful habit, then it's trapped. It's a memory, basically a memory or pattern of behavior that's trapped in this primitive part of the brain. Now, the way that we address that, it's similar to the REM process, again, which I spoke about in a previous video. So if you haven't watched that video, you're not familiar with that process, during our sleep cycle, the hippocampus teaches us about the events of the day. And during REM sleep, it'll process all of the negative thought patterns in our mind that we've accumulated throughout the day, take the emotion away from them, and enable you to process them rationally and intellectually in the intellectual part of the brain. So we use a similar process to that, to the REM process. We move these patterns of behavior from the primitive emotional part of the brain, take the emotion out of it, and move it to the intellectual part of the brain, where you have that rational control, and you can see that with perspective. Now, the memory's not erased; it's not replaced with something else. It's not, we still have an understanding. Going back to the heights example, still have an understanding of heights. We don't want you to be doing handstands on the edge of a skyscraper. We want you to have a rational fear of heights. But that memory, because you have that intellectual control over it, you're able to see with clarity. You're able to see the wood for the trees and get perspective on that. So you can make a rational decision as to whether you want to be exposed to a specific situation with heights, if it's safe, if there's a rational reason why you should be there, then you'll be able to make that decision. You won't be overcome with emotion and have that that negative reaction, which occurred whilst the memory was in the primitive part of the brain. So yeah, there's quite a quick, simple way of ridding yourself of phobias, or at least gaining intellectual control over that phobia and having that control over that situation. Always happy to talk through these concepts. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please just give me a shout.